I'm talking about this subject of what I've called covering our assets. I'm interested in the question of what makes a strengths-based approach to mental health something relevant in our church communities particularly. And given the theme of this evening, it's really important to mention, as others have, that when it comes to mental health, the poorest in our communities often take the hardest hit. And we know, for example, that the poorest fifth of the population are more likely to be at risk of developing a problem than those on middle income, and also opposed to the top 10% of top earners. Now, of course, mental health is a challenge that we all face, but there's no question that for many it is a poverty-related problem. And for churches on the front line of this, it seems that crisis management is often the common experience. And my own experience in an estate-based church in King's Cross has borne this out, and I found that people often ask clergy for support when other support structures fail for them, and they find themselves in a situation where they're in crisis. Something's gone wrong and they come to us. And this can be problematic for us as we attempt to manage a crisis, because I think what happens is that we can default to a place where people become problems that are to be fixed. And there's an illustration that springs to mind to me when I speak to church leaders about their communities in this way, and it's this. Are you familiar with whack-a-mole? So I'm sure I probably don't have to explain too much about the principle of whack-a-mole, and if you haven't played the game, I recommend it. It's really therapeutic. You might even want to install a machine like that in your church to reflect how your ministry is. It's a really good fun thing to play. But for a lot of us, it can be like this. When one thing pops up and we've hit it, another one pops up again and we miss it. And so in the few minutes I've got here, I want to try and sketch out a journey that I think we can go on in order to move away from the whack-a-mole dynamic. I knew I was going to do that. The whack-a-mole dynamic to build a healthy community. And the journey we need to go on, I think, is one which takes us to a place where mental health is everybody's business, and the practice that supports it in our churches can be good for us all. So let's look at these areas. I just want to offer these three areas that we'll look at today. One of our vision. I'd like us to be testing our vision today. I'd like us to briefly touch on theology, and I'd also like us to look at our practice and how we might live as a community in this way. So first of all, let's look at the tools that we have to test our vision. Now, I'm sure that many of us have found that all the effort involved in this type of crisis intervention places us in a very reactive space. And over the last 2 years, the Church Urban Fund and Livability have been supporting churches to explore assets in our communities before we engage in the problems that we face together. And we produced 2 reports. One was called Fullness of Life. The other one was called Building Kingdom Communities. And in these reports and the conversations that followed, we're inviting churches together to engage with stepping away from the idea of, as church, we're there primarily to meet needs, but instead looking at what happens when we're actually, we see our primary call as to be community builders. How does that change how we respond to needs? So a brief review for some of you, and perhaps new learning for others. Asset-based community development, ABCD. So an asset-based approach is an approach to community development which seeks to do the following. First, it looks to identify the community's assets. It looks for what's strong rather than what's wrong. And it also sees individuals in any setting as people with gifts and talents to draw on. The other thing it's interested in is our internal connections. And so that's often to do with the relationships that we have with each other and within our communities. And these internal connections are really important because they can help us focus on what our own problems are. And we don't necessarily need an external expert to do that if we're connected and we can draw from each other. The other thing it's interested in, of course, is external connections, but it's more interested in drawing in other input when you've already had a look at what you've got. And so this approach is really important in terms of how we look at, as it were, community problem solving. And we advocate this approach because it builds capacity and a sense of joint ownership, and in short, it builds community. And so I think this is a helpful framework when it comes to engaging with our mental health and our well-being in our communities. It can help us recognise the interconnectedness of the elements that help us build a healthier community. It's a whole piece, if you like. So next up, we've briefly touched on those foundational principles, and I want to introduce something else in this realm of vision that I think might be a helpful corrective to us. In parallel to the growth of asset-based community development, there's also been the growth of the mental health recovery model, which is a lens, I think, that when we dig into it can be helpful in moving beyond crisis management. When we're in crisis, we often need directive help and intervention, and this is appropriate. But the fixed mentality that can develop can keep us focused on the deficits that are presenting, hence that sense people always have problems that need to be fixed. And it's important that we challenge this. And previous models in mental health practice often tended to look at the pathology of a problem, but sometimes at the expense of the strengths that people brought to their situation. And we heard earlier about people being experts in their own experience. That's a really important value within that. And so what we're looking to do instead within a recovery model is look at the assets the individual has and has also within their community. And so the recovery model affirms that people have the capacity to live well with long-term mental health conditions. And it's a framework which first looks to these assets and recognises that people can and do recover from mental ill health. So a bit more on this. The Mental Health Foundation identifies the following helpful principles in recovery. That it provides a holistic view of mental illness by focusing on the person and not just their symptoms, but everything that they bring to the table, all that they have. It also believes that recovery from severe mental illness is possible. And within this, there's a call for optimism and commitment from all concerned, so all the people that have a stake in the life of that individual. And it's profoundly influenced by people's expectations and attitudes. And also, this particular model, this frame, it values developing spirituality and cultural perspectives. And it fundamentally recognises that recovery is a social task. You know, there are elements of the task of recovery that are all about people's involvement and their relationships. And when we talk about strengths, this can mean all kinds of things. But it could be skills, it could be talents, it could be the resilience that people have intrinsically, their coping strategies, as well as different positive aspects of a person's external and social environments. And these become really important starting points to build from. And so these principles alone can help provide a broader context to developing good mental health, and I think are a useful guide to view the topic, even for a non-professional. It's a great counter to the default of seeing people as something to fix. So, I guess a question to us now is as we look to these values, can we see ourselves aligning to them? Might they change us away from this whack-a-mole dynamic we sometimes find ourselves in? It also seems to me that the lens of the recovery model is hope-filled and is complementary to a theology which finds hope in suffering. So, I've just put it as one statement because I think it's really important, and we've heard from many this evening in terms of the importance of our own theology and what we're bringing to bear on this. Will spoke on this earlier in much more detail than I'm preparing to now. But I'm sure that we'd all agree in this room that we'd be careful in our settings not to perpetuate a theology that suggests poor mental health is a direct consequence of sin. But yet I've found that many of the people who regularly struggle in the context I'm in often make this causal link. And equally, an overly victorious theology can tell them that they're not trying hard enough. And maybe they don't have enough faith if they're not seeing full healing. So what then might be a correction to this? We need to offer a theology which speaks of the crucified God that stands with us in suffering. And in my own context, where many members regularly experience poor mental health, there's a greater need to hear and experience the grace of God. And this is a corrective to the negative self-talk that many struggle with. And for those in the depths of difficulty, we need to remember that all things are not equal for us, and that for many of us, recognising what a wretched machine we are trying to drive is fundamental in starting to build a positive approach. Also, though, if we're drawing from the best of our theology, how open, though, are our routes to participation? Our theology that affirms our personhood, our value, and our participation in God's kingdom is one that I think is truly liberating. So how then might our theology link to practice? Church creates community, and our churches have an important role in creating an environment where deeper relationships and meaningful activity provide a space for building good mental health. They can often be safe spaces to grow in new skills and exercise old ones. And creating these right routes to participation can play a significant part in developing well-being, and it's fundamental for building a healthy community. But also, I'd encourage us to be unafraid to look at our own cognitive dissonance. What is our own gap between what we preach and what we practice? And a programmatic approach to church can often be a very efficient way of running the show, but it can often leave those with complex lives with less to bring. You know, the efficiency of the machine sort of takes precedence over involvement. Also, I think we need to ensure that we're starting conversations from the right place. And making it safe to speak is also important. And perhaps the first steps within this might start with us talking about our own well-being and what good practice might look like. It's an easier entry point for people, and it's a conversation that we can all be part of. And this is one of the reasons why Livability trains individuals to run the happiness course in their communities. And partly the function of this is to help communities normalise the process of talking about their own well-being. And so the course uses a strengths-based approach that helps groups discover what choices can lead to a richer and more fulfilled life. And it's a great starter for a church, I think, that is looking to seek to build, if you like, a culture of well-being, because it provides a safe space to explore thoughts and emotions on important topics of life. And if our churches are places where we are unafraid to explore these issues, then, of course, our practice can follow too. So, building on our practice, if we were to look at our life together as church and identify our healthiest practice, I wonder what that might be. What might those healthy practices look like in our life together? Are there elements of our life as church that feel genuinely restorative, or are we running ourselves ragged? We can all benefit from practices that help us exercise creativity, practice stillness, and connect to our bodies in positive ways. What might the win-win activities which lead us to restoring ourselves and offering those to others might be? And I think, for example, of the Christian meditation group, which I've been part of, which extended its practice to everybody in that community. Now, it was relaxing to run and it was relaxing to attend. And yet within it, there was an embodied spirituality in life together that was very important to the way that we were. And I think within models like this, we can ensure that well-being is not destined to be an exclusive consumer product for the wealthy, but actually something that we can all join together in seeking to embody in our practice, in our life together. So in conclusion, our journey, I think, is to move from whack-a-mole crisis management to a place where we're all taking part in building a healthy community. So to do that, let's make sure that we're cleaning our lenses, that we're looking at things in the best way possible, that we're starting to widen our conversation, and that we are making our churches places where these conversations really happen. And we're drawing from the best that our theology can bring. And there, in time, we can evolve our practice to a place to make our communities be places where all might thrive.